Hi, this is Lamar, and you're listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Getting to Third Space is produced by Tenacious Change, a consultancy committed to creating resilient, nonprofit organizations. This podcast is available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts. Wherever you listen to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom, be sure to subscribe to hear about new episodes when they become available. Also, be sure to share this podcast with friends, colleagues, and family. The more people join us, the quicker we get to third space as a society.
Hey, good morning, Lamar. How you doing today?
Good morning, Tom. I am doing great. I've gotten my coffee, my French press coffee today.
Your French press coffee.
My favorite cup. That's right.
That sounds very fancy. French pressed.
Yeah, well, it's donut, Dunkin' Donuts coffee.
Oh, well, hey, you can't get any better than Dunkin' Donuts, but, wow. Although I really like the donuts too, but,
Yeah. Not to say that we're sponsored by Dunkin' Donuts at all.
No, we're not sponsored by, but if Dunkin' Donuts wants to sponsor us,
we'll take it.
We're completely open. Hey, so in celebration today, man, look at that, somewhere in my
I love it. Go Hawks,
Iowa
man.
switch. Go Hawks. I mean, she did it. Caitlin Clark actually did it. Can you imagine? She is now the number one scorer in women's basketball in the history of the NCAA. Woo!
Absolutely.
All right, we just give her a little applause there.
I got to tell you, if you have an ear on sports at all, you couldn't have missed this because it is all over the news, and it's impressive.
Over the news.
It's impressive.
It's impressive, and at the same time, let's acknowledge a couple of things. One is that, prior to the existence of the NCAA, there were a couple of other women that really scored huge numbers in the basketball leagues that existed prior to that time, and Caitlin hasn't reached those plateaus yet. So this is just specific to the NCAA, but it's a monumental achievement, and now she's closing in on Pistol Pete Maravich.
Oh, isn't that amazing?
To be the all-time NCAA scorer, and she has 4 games left. And by the way, these are going to be 4 pretty tough games coming up before they get into the tournament season. But she could do it. She's within 100 points of Pete Maravich.
No, that's incredible.
Yeah. So
this morning I watched part of the first game that she ever played in the NCAA for Iowa. It was amazing. There was nobody there. Zero. Right. It was during COVID, right? Nobody was there. And so you could hear everyone say whatever they said on the court and the coaches. And it was like the ball would bounce and it would echo.
Yeah. Oh, so. I saw a snippet of one of those when they were showing her highlights reel back last week, the night that she broke the record. And it was stunning. But hey, Lamar, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but that play you missed when we were seeing the game live?
You will not let me forget this, will you?
So they showed her 5 best scoring. I mean, her big 3-pointers, right?
Yeah.
Number 3 of those 5 was the one that she made when we saw her live. I hope you got to see it this time.
Yeah, just grind it into the wound a little further, Tom. I think you even put it in the show notes for people to watch.
I did in the interview with Ed Traeger, and so yes.
Yeah, but I have seen it, and by the way, just full disclosure, everyone at the table took their opportunity to take a break. I thought, okay, this is mine. And what did and the restrooms were a mere 10, 20, 30 feet away, right?
I know, they were right behind us, man.
Oh, the story of my life. Lamar missed the greatest play at the game.
Oh, but actually, last week when she scored those she scored the first 8 points. She only needed 8 points to break the record. She scored the first 8 points for the Hawkeyes last week against Michigan to break the record. And
That's
and that the shot that broke the record was a logo 3.
It was.
And if people don't know what we mean by that, we mean that she hit it from the logo in the center of the floor.
Right.
Which is what 35 feet or something. It was an amazing shot, and she just threw, and it was nothing but net. It just boom, that was it.
Well, for those who are tired of hearing us talk about Caitlin Clark and the Hawkeyes, I'm sorry, but we're just excited about it.
We are, and it's, we're Clarksies, right? And by the way, yeah, we're Clarksies. I mean, there's Swifties,
like Swifties.
There's Clarksies, right? And so we're Clarksies, and I hate to do a scoop on QAnon here, all right? But I have some breaking news.
Now, we've said we were going to kind of, go easy here.
Yeah, Caitlin Clark and her boyfriend, whom you kind of saw at the end of the game last week when he came out and congratulated her with a kiss, okay? Caitlin Clark and her boyfriend, whose name I don't know, they're going to come out and endorse me for president. I'm just saying. There you go. So there, QAnon, I beat you to it. Have fun.
Tom for president kind of reminds me of Joe Walsh for president or whomever else. Okay, let's move on from this frivolity.
Okay, yeah, actually, it's going downhill quickly.
It is. So
we probably should.
We should. In this episode, we want to return to a comment asked by one of our listeners, which we know is a tongue-in-cheek comment. But on the other side of it, it was an interesting comment that got us thinking. And I'll quote it again. He says, "Hi, Lamar and Tom. Very well done. But what if I'm already on third space or in third space? I guess I'll have to wait for you guys to catch up." Smiley face. So we just got to chattering back and forth. We got to thinking, now, wait a minute. What about first and second space? We spent some time talking about places, and there's some really interesting similarities between places and spaces. But what about first and second space? So what do you think? Is there a first and second space, and how do you navigate that?
Ooh, that's a good question. And actually, so I think there actually are, Lamar. I think there is a first space and the second space as well as a third space. And I don't know that you will necessarily see it this way, but this is why we're having this conversation, and we're just kind of musing about this. And, people can take it, all of this is gospel if they like, or they can, if you want to build a whole new conspiracy theory around it, that's perfectly fine too. But we're just really kind of musing and, as you said, spitballing here on this. But for me, those three spaces are kind of I don't want to call it an attitude, but it's more kind of a state of mind for me. When I'm in a first, second, or third space, I'm more in a state of mind in terms of how I'm guided to interact with people. So for example, for me, the first space is a quiet space, and it's a place where I'm thinking about the conversation that I'm hearing, or I'm thinking about a topic that I might want to engage with people on. But I may not yet feel sure enough or confident enough to voice my ideas about it. And, or I may just be waiting around, hanging out, waiting to be invited into the conversation, or looking for an opening or opportunity to engage with people. Honestly, I should probably spend more time in first base because it's not uncomfortable for me to be there, but I tend to be an impatient person. And so what can happen for me is that I may engage before I fully form the thoughts. And so so one of the things that can happen for me is that as I'm engaging, I'm also processing. I I guess there's different ways of processing information, right? And I think you
Sure.
probably know this well enough about me to know that I'm a talker processor. I process as I talk and as I throw things out there and I listen to them come back to me through the voices of other people or even just hearing them with my own ears. That's a way for me to kind of process and think about uh, how I want to engage or what I'm or what is important to me. But for me, that first space is really that point where I'm sitting back and I'm listening and I'm processing and I'm thinking. Like I said, I should probably be there more than in second space. But when I think of first space, that's what it is for me. What is it for
Okay.
you when you think of first space?
Well, first, let me kind of respond to the processing thing because I think that is such an individual thing that it's important to know yourself. We talked about this in the past on the podcast. It's important to know you and how you respond and how you think. Um, or important for me to know myself, and I process differently depending on kind of what space I'm in. My wife and I have, we've been married since 1976, and we have um, we've talked a lot about processing because sometimes that's been an issue, and sometimes it's something we had to learn about each other. But one of my challenges has been being asked a question or posed an idea, and I don't respond. It's because I'm thinking and I'm processing about it, and it takes a while sometimes, but it appears like I'm ignoring, or I'm being, I'm not engaged in the act. And so I've really had to work at trying to be a bit more responsive as I'm processing.
Hmm.
Um, and and so knowing yourself in these states is important. So the second piece that I wanted to get to in your question. So for me to get an idea about first base, I think I have to once again remember what I think third space is. And I think third space, again, while we talk about it as a safe place to have difficult conversations, it's really more than that. It's also a place where people with differentiating levels of authority and power can come to the table, and it's a level playing field. Or maybe where they're not, a person is not heard in other types of conversation. Intentionally, the person is allowed to be heard in a third space conversation, but that doesn't come without risk. So if I'm going to move into a third space, my level of risk of going into that conversation increases. So then I think about first space and eventually second. But if I think about first space, I think about my level of risk is low. In these kinds of conversations, I think it doesn't matter so much where the playing field is at because the conversation doesn't have the level of risk to it. And that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. And maybe I've been trying to think of examples. It's much more casual, much less critical kinds of conversations, maybe even more interactive. You and I started out by talking about Iowa basketball. Um, you know, I've been in the business world where I was talking to people who had much higher levels of responsibility and authority than I had, but we were talking about things that we both had the same level of maybe expertise or interest in, and had nothing to do with the kind of roles that we play in the job or in the relationship. And to me, that's kind of a first space place. So my risk level in the conversation is much lower, or it doesn't matter so much. Um, it's a much more casual conversation. I'm in that space a lot, probably. Um, but in a conversation, it can move very quickly from that first place conversation to a less of an interactive conversation and much more of an intense, or the risk level goes higher based off what our relationships are. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I think that maybe I'm not sure we're saying exactly the same thing, but I think there's elements of your perspective and mine that are similar. In
Sure.
that certainly when so I'm looking at it from a very kind of personal place. When I'm engaged in a first space conversation, there really is no conversation per se, and therefore the risk is there's none. Because
Right.
I'm not engaging at that point. I'm just listening. I'm kind of taking it in. And what I'm hearing you say is that you're thinking of this as really kind of this kind of step up towards a third space, and in that first space, it's the risk is much less for a person. The
Right.
topics are maybe safer. They're a little bit easier for people to engage on. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I think so. And when I think of when I was working with the organization that I was with before, where I might go out into the shop. So it was a manufacturing company. So I might leave the office area, go out into the shop, and stop and talk with someone about, kind of the machines that we had. Maybe talk a little bit about processes, and we were learning and interacting with each other. And then I get a question about, okay, Lamar, can you tell me about this new policy that's coming out, or kind of what to expect? And suddenly that relationship shifts from just kind of this interactive conversation to now the stakes are a bit higher. The risk is a bit higher. I have to be careful about what I say to make sure I'm accurate and not leading someone with information that I'm maybe thinking might come out, but is going to be helpful. And the other person senses that I'm being more careful in my responses. To me, I'm shifting spaces, if that makes some
Okay.
sense.
So can you say a little bit more, since you're shifting spaces here, can
Okay.
you say a little bit more about your thinking about, then what is that second space?
Yeah, so I would see second space. Actually, I would see what I just described as like a second space,
Mm-hmm.
or for the other individual I'm conversing with. He or she may have been, he felt free or she felt free to ask me that question as part of our interaction. And the risk level went up, but it wasn't at a high risk level. It was at okay, I've got this guy who knows something I'd like to know, so I'm going to pose a question, or I might get, as Lamar being Lamar, I might get this person saying, "Let me tell you what I think. Or here's what I would hope would happen with the new policy coming out." Or if I'm in another group meeting, and the group is there's a leader having a conversation, I might say, "Hey, there's something I want to share." My risk level is higher because I'm taking it. Um, I'm willing to share more about where my position is, knowing that I may not. Um, the outcome may not be totally dependent on me, and if the outcome is not what I want, it's not catastrophic, but it's part of a interaction. Or if I'm in a conversation just with, um, someone who is pretty dogmatic on their point of view, I don't have to go full fledged into third space. I can have this conversation, say, "Here's what I'm thinking," and we can have a brief conversation, or even I can listen a lot to what they're saying, but I don't have to move into a more uh, develop that environment to where everyone is making sure they're heard at the same level. It can be it can be an okay conversation. Now I know what they're thinking, or they know what I think, and we part ways.
Hmm.
Or we're learning from each other, but it's not that full-fledged third space where I think we have to be incredibly thoughtful to move into third space, or have done it so well that we move into it, fairly easily,
Hmm.
because that's kind of a muscle memory thing that we talked about at one point.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know. What do you
I,
think about second
well,
space?
well, I'm well, for me, I think that a similarity in what you're saying is that the second space is that point at which a person kind of moves out of the first space and begins to engage people in conversation, perhaps in a different way. Um, what I have found for myself, and perhaps others have found, is that how I engage with somebody in second space is often dependent upon what's been happening with me in first space.
Hmm.
So if I've been struggling to feel some certainty or confidence that I can absolutely enter into the conversation, um, I may my initial attempts to engage may be rather timid, and and that's because I'm reducing the risk for myself that things are going to go sideways and I'm going to be in trouble for what I've said or what I've been thinking or what I'm suggesting here, right? Um, so my initial attempts, if that's the space I've been in that first space is just struggling to feel like I know what the heck's going on and how to engage, and I may still engage because I feel like I'm obligated to engage. Maybe I'm in a position of authority, or so-called authority, or a position of responsibility where I have to do something. But if I'm not completely sure, my attempts may be rather timid and come across as not very confident, and then as a result maybe not taken very seriously. Alternatively, what may happen for me is that I am sitting there listening and I'm thinking about it, and I'm beginning to heat up with opinions. Not heat up in an angry way, but just like,
Yeah.
oh man, things are just flashing like crazy for me. And so then when I jump into that second space, uh, um, a second space conversation at that point for me looks like more almost like a for less of for lack of a better term, a debate. I'm in now and I'm saying, okay, well, here's what I think about this, and here's why I think you need to reconsider this or look at this. Da, 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 da. Um, Sometimes I'm blessed with too many opinions, and
Yeah,
with a and with a weak ability to withhold those opinions. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, Lamar, but I think the older I get, the more my opinions just kind of hang out there. It's kind of like, oh, nuts to it. Here's my opinion. Here's what I think. Like it, love it, live with it. I don't care. It's just my opinion. But I think that the danger for me in that situation is that when I jump into that space, then I may try to drive the conversation and push my ideas on others, and frankly, that tends to be that has tended to be me. When that happens, and it's not a part of myself that I like. It's not something I'm very proud of. It's not something I'm very happy with, except in cases of emergency or crisis. I mean, sometimes I've had to step in and say, it's going to be this way, and this way, and that's all there is to it. And boom. I managed a youth camp for a number of years, as you know. And there are times when I had to make those kinds of decisions, and there was no conversation. It was, this has to happen, and it has to happen in this way now, for the safety of young people. So it's so for me, that second space is where I come out of the quiet space, that first space. But maybe sometimes too timidly, and sometimes maybe too strong. And in both cases, though, and going back to your concept of risk here, there's a risk in both of those. The risk is that you may not be given any attention or paid attention to at all if you're too timid or lacking sufficient confidence. The other risk is that you could really alienate people with it, and in terms of how you come out with your guns blazing, as they say. So, yeah, I just don't see a second space dialogue as being many times very productive.
I'm not sure that far off. So, by the way, we're exercising quite a few third space processes here as we go, as you and I go through this, just to be quite, clear. But I don't think we're quite off. Although I don't think I don't put a qualifier on whether first or second or third space is better than the other. I see them as just different. I think second space is really important. I think it's important to have conversations where we don't agree. I think it's important to even be in debate. Now, debate means different things to different people. For me, the one part about debate that I don't care so much about is actually trying to prove somebody's position is wrong. I don't particularly care for that, but that is part of a lot of debates as well. I think that does belong in second space, to be honest with you. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing with the right context. But I got to tell you, it wears me out. You can tell me if you're in this place or not, but it wears me out when every time I have a conversation with someone, it is a debate. And I have to be careful that I don't come across that way as well. And, shame on me if I do. But if people aren't willing to come into conversation with me in a second space because they just are tired of me, harping on the same thing, I need to be careful that I don't go down that route as well. But I do think that there is room for us to have important conversations that I think are more intentional than first space and have more substance and interaction and even spitballing like we're doing today. I think those are important conversations. I learn from them, and I hope other people learn from them as well if we value them. But if our goal is to come out a winner,
well, you kind of mentioned you wouldn't call it this perhaps, but I think you kind of mentioned a pet peeve you have there, right? That
maybe
my pet peeve is getting into a debate with somebody when the facts are not in agreement.
Oh, give us an example.
Well, okay. So, we were talking with Ed Traeger about this, right? What is valid? And so getting into a conversation with somebody around something that, okay, so let me let me go down this rabbit hole. All right.
Okay.
All right. So, and I know that aside from having a wonderful time in Iowa and seeing Caitlin Clark play, that when my wife and I got back, a few days later, we tested positive for COVID. Now I'm calling that the Iowa COVID. Okay. So, but we tested positive for COVID for the first time in 4 years. And we're just coming off of 2 weeks of being very, very sick with it. Now, according to the CDC standards, we had a mild case of COVID.
Okay.
But let me tell you, if it was a mild case, I don't want anything worse because it was pretty rough. It was pretty rough. Now, all of that, given the fact that we have been fully vaccinated with every booster, we have had the RSV shot. We have our flu shots. We have our pneumonia shots. We've had shingle shots. We have had shots upon shots upon shots. I mean, we are immunized to death. And as soon as we tested positive, we were on the phone with our doctor, and we got Paxlovid and the other medicine, an equivalent to that. My wife was on one. I was on the Paxlovid, and we started that right away. Now, you know what? There are folks that I could have this conversation with about COVID, and they would say to me, "It was all in your head. You know, the vaccines did nothing. The Paxlovid did nothing. It's all a conspiracy." I don't have much patience for that. And that's not a valid fact based upon scientific evidence. And that's my pet peeve in the second space. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm talking about?
No, I do. I think that might be moving into third space.
What?
Yeah. No, let me
because I want to reach through and bottle them?
No, not at all. Not the conversation as you described it, but I think the need to have verification for what you talk about.
Right.
To me, that's a third space approach to handling things. A second space might be, here's my opinion.
Right.
But
right.
And I get it. You're talking about people expressing opinion as fact.
Right. Oh, and let me close the loop on that.
Yeah, please do.
So we were talking just yesterday because we finally, after 2 weeks of trying to live separate lives in a condo, right? We finally had breakfast together.
You and your wife, yes.
Yeah, me and my wife. We finally had breakfast together yesterday. We were talking about this, and the realization hit us that had it not been for the vaccines, if it had not been from Paxlovid, and if this had been 4 years ago, we'd both be in very serious shape right now. I mean, those things allowed us to survive this, because even with all of those things, it was not a pleasant experience. And we saw our blood oxygen drop, not to the point where we had to have attention, but, it was concerning. It was concerning. We had to pay attention, monitor those things. And if that happens with all of that intervention, what would it have been like 4 years ago had we had that? And we're both of an age,
That's a really good example of a second space conversation that is probably goes off the rails. If you don't bring in good and that's where debate comes in. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of what I would call second space conversations, where people don't have it's opinion, and opinion becomes fact in the presentation. Problematic. I agree with you. Pet peeve. I'll check that one off for you. That's a good one.
All right, thank you.
Good job.
Remind me the next time I have to think of a pet peeve.
Let's go back to that one. No, that was well done. I appreciate that. It helps me understand.
Thanks for putting me on the spot with that one.
I can see it in your eyes.
The terror.
But I think so. I go back to my very first comment when we got into this here today, and that is when I think about first space and second space, I have to go back to what I understand third space to be. To me, that's important, and maybe we ought to go back and talk about that just a little bit.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about moving from what you described in that second space into third space. How does that look to you, making that movement? And do you make that movement intentionally? Is it something that is kind of an automatic, or how do you see going from one space to the next?
Well, okay, so let's take that COVID conversation, and the vaccination and all that conversation, right? So I think that if my better angels are sitting on my shoulder,
gotcha.
and I'm in that second space conversation with somebody who is saying to me, well, but you know what, none of that actually helped. It was probably taking vitamin C and doing squats in the corners or something. So.
You did squats in the corners?
No, not really. But,
okay, sure.
But well, Tai Chi sometimes has you doing squats.
Yeah.
But so I, if I wanted to shift that conversation, I think for me, and this is just kind of an aha that I had in this last week. as I've been thinking about preparing for this particular podcast, I was reminded of one of the works of Edgar Schein. Edgar Schein is now deceased. He's a psychologist who actually his earliest work was in deprogramming American prisoners of war in the Korean War. And one of the things that he has written about has been about the need for suspension, which is to kind of pause and to listen and to pay attention to what's going on. But then he came out just a few years ago with a book called Humble Inquiry. And in Humble Inquiry, he defines that as the fine art of drawing someone out, of asking questions to which you do not already know the answer. And that's a really big idea there, of building a relationship based on curiosity and interest in the other person. And when I think about what third space dialogue looks like and how a second space conversation can be shifted to a third space conversation, it is in the use of humble inquiry. So for example, if I'm in that conversation with the person that's telling me that you didn't really have COVID yet, whatever,
Right.
then a humble inquiry approach there would be for me to calm myself down, and then just say, ask something like, tell me more about why it is you think I didn't have COVID, or tell me more about why you think the vaccines aren't real. And because I don't know the answer to that for that person. And that is a genuine question on my part, because to me, it's inconceivable that they could hold those beliefs, or that they could question my experience and say, oh, no, you didn't have COVID, or, whatever, So a really humble question for me to be able to ask them is to not argue, but to step back and say, tell me more about why you believe you don't think that we had COVID, or you don't think the vaccines actually did anything for us, or Paxlovid did anything for us. And try to really listen to what it is that they're saying. Does that get us to resolve the issue? Perhaps not. But what it does do is it creates a space that opens it up for conversation, as opposed to just me getting so frustrated that I really do want to throttle them or just walk away, right?
Right.
Is that making sense?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's similar to how I kind of perceive third space. You can't make that shift emotionally, for example, if you're fired up about what the other person's saying. To make that shift, you have to know yourself. You have to make an intentional decision. And I think that's where I'm at. I think third space is a very intentional space. And if I'm going to say, okay, I need to listen to this person and try to understand why their position is what it is, and do I have something I can learn from what their position is? That's a big shift.
Yeah.
And then remember we talked about risks at the beginning of this podcast.
Right.
That raises your risk, because you might be wrong. You might actually learn something. Now I know you're going to.
No, Lamar, I am never wrong. But,
I can see that in your eyes today. but I think that entering into where you're going to ask a question that you don't know the answer to,
yeah,
is where you get risk. And I think that's a great place to be. But you can't just. I don't think you can just say, let me ask the question without having a preparation, without having prepared yourself in some way. Now, I think over time, you can move in and out of that, just kind of like the experience that I was sharing, at work with an employee who was out on the floor. We moved from first to second space. We could easily have moved into third space also if we would have found the right kind of environment to do it. But there are times where you don't want to move into that space either.
Yeah.
If you don't feel you're ready to hear, or if
Hmm.
the other person's not ready to play at the same level, let's not go to that space. I don't think it's fruitful. But so I think
Hmm.
I think third space is a very thoughtful place. You have to prepare yourself with great thought and check your emotions, look at the power level positions, and also I think you have to go into it with wanting an outcome.
Hmm.
Why am I willing, or why are we, whoever's going to go into that space, willing to go into it in the first place?
Yeah.
Uh, it's not to prove a point; it's to come up with some sort of outcome.
Hmm.
And if we don't know what that outcome is, maybe we shouldn't go into this space. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's what I'm throwing out there. I think of it. You and I have had this conversation a little bit. Actually, people are getting a good perspective of the kind of conversations you and I have on the side.
Yes, they are.
But I think of this sometimes as gears.
Hmm.
Lately I've been a Jeep guy. I've enjoyed driving Jeeps, and I enjoy driving Jeeps sometimes in the back country and sometimes just down the highway. My brother and I were in Colorado and took our sons and nephews fishing. Well, he and I got kind of tired of not catching fish, so we went on a ride into the national forest in a Jeep. It was great fun. We were following his back trails till we come to one trail that was. I have a Jeep Grand Cherokee, so it's not like a tricked out Jeep. It's a stock Jeep, right?
Hmm.
We come to this road that on the map says we have to go down this road to get to where we want to go eventually, and it is steep, full of ruts, and it is there's you can tell people have been four wheeling up and down this thing. So we just put it in low gear and we started crawling down the hill. And we were having a great time. My brother was filming it. And then these guys come shooting up the hill on wearing these helmets and gear and, and these tricked out four-wheel drive machines, and they're just going by us in our stock Jeep, just crawling down the hill. Something was out of place in that story, right?
Right.
but
Didn't
and
they,
he,
didn't they know they were out of place? They didn't need all that stuff?
that's right, that's right. But my point being is we shifted into gear very intentionally, and we worked our way down very intentionally to get to the bottom. And
Yeah.
I think of moving into third space as shifting into a low gear, being aware of my surroundings, being aware of the risk, being aware of what my accomplished goals need to be, and trusting. I got to trust the other person who's in that conversation to be in the same place I am, or it's not going to, the outcome could be tragic versus a
Yeah.
good outcome. If
Yeah.
that makes sense to you.
It does. I really like that concept of intentionality. And I think that is something that we hold in common in terms of our view. I mean, I think there's many things we hold in common with regard to our view of what third space is, but that intentionality piece is I think really really important. I
Yeah.
don't think you I don't think you necessarily always. There are times, and this is actually something we're probably going to talk about in a minute anyway. But I don't think that there's many times when we actually just kind of fall into third space. I think that
Yeah.
most times we are very intentional about it because it's important. We need to be able to do that, and allows us to be able to build relationship and move forward in a way that being in first or second space doesn't allow us to.
Yeah. I don't think we ought to consider third space as exclusive, meaning that you can't move in and out of it.
Hmm.
I think it's just awareness and
Right.
making determination. Like in your COVID example, now I'm going to move into this space. So I have to think and respond differently, and I've got to check a few things.
Right.
I I think over time, and maybe because of the work that we've done in the past, we can move in and out a lot quicker. But if you don't have that experience, and I still have to check myself a lot, but if you don't have that experience, taking a deep breath, stepping away is always a good practice, I think, before you move into that conversation.
Mhm. Well, so I'm thinking back to our listener who posed the question,
Yeah.
and he the listener also raises kind of an interesting question about is it possible to stay in third space and still live in the first and second spaces? Um, he or she may have just been joking, right, and saying, "I'm already in third space, waiting for you guys to catch up." I don't know, but it's hard for me to imagine actually existing continuously in the third space. What are you thinking?
I'm actually in agreement because I think that I think there's some people who are really good at having that kind of a relationship with other people. They're very accepting. They're very intuitive. They're listening. I don't think that's the case for most folks. I think it's hard to be in that space. But I think with practice or with different personality types or different experiences, people can move in and out of them quicker. I don't think I could live in third space and then simultaneously be in other third spaces. I think it is dependent on my current state and interaction and who I'm with and what we're talking about. I've talked about this coffee group many times, right?
Right.
One of these times,
what coffee group, Lamar?
My Friday,
I'm gonna come down there and I'm gonna join your coffee. I'm gonna see if they really exist or if they're a figment of your imagination.
Boy, will they have questions for you.
I can't wait.
No, I think, but I think about how quickly we can move from something that is mundane, like lately it's been cutting, cutting trees and moving wood and that kind of thing, which is kind of fun to talk about, to things that are more related to some, we're all part of a church group, and that has some intensities to it sometimes, or there's political things that are happening that has a little bit different intensities. And we realize we're not all on the same page. So we then have to think differently about how we respond. And that can happen within a minute or minutes or seconds, actually, in a conversation like that. It just depends on the ebb and flow of how the conversations go. But I don't see that kind of a scenario. If we go back to places, we talked about places, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we could move in those places into third space without sitting back and saying, okay, let's talk about this. Mm-hmm. And people can join or not join. I think that I don't see an easy way to just stay in third space and just be in the other spaces as well. I could be all wet.
What about just kind of slipping into a third space without planning ahead? I mean, we talked about intentionality, that we have to be, but is it possible to just kind of slip into a third space without even planning or thinking, without intentionality?
What would that look like?
I'm asking you, what would that look like?
Well, a great therapist response was, tell me about that, right?
Yeah. All right. So I'll let you off the hook. I'll tell you what comes to mind for me. So people know, if they've read a little bit about us, that we both spent some time in the clergy, and I discovered. By the way, I just want to be very, very clear. I was a really lousy pastor. I just want to say that. I will confess it. I was lousy. But there was one thing that I found really interesting about my time working as a minister of a local church, and that is that I had an unusual comfort at deathbeds. Now, my first job in high school was digging graves with my dad. So
that's a whole other podcast. We have to go there.
Who was a local grave digger, right? But that was my first job, and mowing cemeteries and digging graves. But I don't think that really had anything to do with it. I think there was something in that moment as a person was approaching death. And I found myself, first space went away because it was not a time for me as the minister to these people to be disengaged. Second space was not appropriate. in a sense of me taking the lead and ushering and all of that kind of stuff. The third space seemed to be, and of course at that time we're looking back, almost 50 years. That third space wasn't something that I was necessarily conscious of. But it was very much this kind of moving into this space of, what can I do? How can I be helpful? And then I remember so many times that after the person passed, I would just sit with the family in silence for a period of time and let whatever happened needed to happen. And I would wait, and when they would begin to engage with one another and with me, that's when I would begin to engage back. So in a sense, the third space wasn't a lot about engagement, but it was about being present. And I think that's the expression of third space that that I found myself very comfortable with. And oddly, when my father died, I was present in the room when he died, and I played the exact same role in that situation as the youngest of the family. That it was. I remember that moment when it seemed like everybody in my family just kind of turned and looked at me, and what do we do? What happens next? And so it's been an unusual gift, I guess, that I've had, that to be comfortable in the presence of death when somebody is transitioning from this life. So that's what comes to mind for me. And sorry, it's kind of a morbid one,
No,
so
fine.
Maybe I should throw in a joke at this point.
No, don't do that. No, don't go there. But I did want to kind of follow up with that, because I think that it comes back to awareness, self-awareness, intentionality, reading. We talked about this. Third space is important to be able to read the other person, be respectful, right?
Yeah.
And in times of despair or crisis, we both walked through some very critical times where there's been crisis happening in the people around us. Being able to be in those times and be present, like you were talking about with your family and with others, being present and reading what's going on and being responsive, because you don't go in with a plan. You don't go in with a position that you're going to convince people that, it's okay because, or with all of your all of the possible trite responses you could come up with. The most important thing is to be present and to read the room, read the people, and to connect, and to come to a particular conclusion at some point.
Yeah.
That's a third space. That's a whole different way of thinking about third space than maybe we've talked about before, but I think it's a really important way to understand it. I appreciate that.
So do you have any examples of sliding into third space?
Oh my gosh.
Sliding into third space. There we go.
Or being hit right in the face with the third space. And there are. And, we're kind of... And you and I will have a conversation here one of these days about some things that I've been through, and we need to talk about that.
Yeah, we do.
And it just, for those listening, you may know, I was involved in a workplace shooting, and it was traumatic, and it was a very difficult thing. And all of these things we have talked about come into play in a situation like that. And particularly if you're in a particular role, a leadership role, as well as a victim role, and relationships, all of those things come into play. Well, and I think the time is coming, we'll talk about it. So being able to read a traumatic situation, a crisis situation, I think those are the things that sometimes they're unfortunate that you have those you have come to the point where you can do those things.
Yeah.
And um, coming out here, coming out in the near future is going to be an article I think we'll talk about um, that myself and some others have been interviewed by journalists. So we'll talk about that. Um, but I remember in the midst of that whole scenario, my son sent me a text saying, "Hey, Dad, you were kind of being prepared for this all of your life." And it's like, that's not fair, right? But on the other side of it, thoughtfully, just as you, myself, and so many of us, we don't know how we're going to use all of the experiences and all the training and all the things that we've learned over life to handle things.
Yeah.
That's when you move into that third space and you pull on all of those resources because there's that outcome you're trying to get to. You may not even know what the outcome is, but I think you and I both come from the point of we want to be able to be helpful to people and helpful to our environment and helpful to our society.
Yeah.
When that's our goal, ultimate goal, you try to find your way through it. And that, I'm going to put this out there, both you and I and others, we make mistakes along the way. We might be in third space and we screw it up, or we say something, or we think we want to do something and it's not the right thing. The important part is that we are aware that we just screwed up and we need to backtrack.
Yeah.
And here's maybe something that I'll throw out here towards the end of our conversation, and that is one of the greatest gifts of a leader, or the characteristics of a leader or someone who is working with other people, is the ability to admit that they're wrong.
Oh yeah.
And the ability to step back, and the ability to listen. And that's a third space quality. Yeah. If I'm really listening, like you're going to this conversation about COVID, if you're really listening and the person comes up with some things that make some sense, you need to sit back and go, I hadn't thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, then maybe I need to make some changes.
Yeah.
So point well taken. Moving in and out of third space, again, I think it's intentional, but I also think that it comes maybe easier or naturally depending on your training and experience.
Yeah. Good point. Well, the old clock on the computer says we probably ought to wind this up. Let's just kind of, why don't you take us into a very quick conversation about what we see coming up in the future here on this podcast.
So as Tom and I have had the chance to kind of just get our brain cells firing again, there's some things that come up. One is, after talking with Ed especially, how has communication changed? And in fact, I talked with a listener who kept saying, Lamar, you and Tom, you danced around a point, but you haven't really explored that point. Well, what's that point? Well, that point is how communication has changed, how technology has impacted our ways of communicating. There's a lot of stuff out there on this. And I think it would be worthy of our time to spend some time thinking about that, how that applies to the kind of work that we're talking about here and the kind of processes. So speed of communication, are we responsible for the things that we say? And I think it's important to realize that when we say something, when we put it out there in these kind of conversations we're talking about, it's hard to take it back.
Especially with technology, because, Google keeps it all, right? I mean, or somebody keeps it all.
Yeah, don't think that it's not out there somewhere.
It's out there.
Oh, yeah. So these are the kinds of things we've been talking about. But please remember, as listeners, that we really do value what you tell us, whether you pull us aside, whether you send us a note or post something on our site. We want to be responsive. We do listen to those. And, there's a couple of ways to be in touch with us. Not only can you just get a hold of us directly if you happen to know us, but you can leave a message, voicemail on Spotify. And of course, the emails, mine is lamar.thirdspace@gmail.com, and Tom's is tom.thirdspace@gmail.com. And remember, third space is spelled with the numeral 3. So There we are, Tom.
Yeah.
It's been our musings today.
Those are our musings. And Lamar, one last thing. I want people to pay attention to the fact that we have a new logo. If they haven't noticed that. And kudos to your spouse for taking that photo of us when we were together in Iowa City for the game, and we cartoonized it, and so we're using that logo now, and we kind of look like that.
A little bit. And who knows where this is going to go, but yeah. All right, man. It's been great having this conversation. I really enjoy it every time. Yep.
Yeah, me too. Talk to you later, Lamar.
All right, take care, man.
Bye-bye. Tom here. Thank you for listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Remember to click on subscribe to be sure you get notices about new episodes. Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom is a production of Tenacious Change. Opinions and ideas expressed in this podcast are solely those of Lamar, Roth, and Tom Klaus. And we'd like to hear your opinions and ideas too. You can leave us a voice message on Spotify, or you can email us at the addresses found in the show notes. Also, in the show notes, you can find links to some of the things we talked about today, so you can check them out for yourself. Until next time, keep moving toward third space.